Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's April 17th, 2026. We'll start with a horrible story on the other side of the pond. This report comes from Unity News Net. The trial of a homosexual couple who adopted a baby boy will begin this month in Preston Crown Court in England. Jamie Varley, age 36, and John McGowan Fazakerley, age 31, stand accused of raping a 13-month-old baby to death within 3 months of the child being placed in their care. Varley denies the murder and manslaughter of Preston on July 27, 2023. He has also pleaded not guilty to 2 counts of assault by penetration, 5 counts of cruelty, and 1 count of grievous bodily harm. He denies 12 counts of taking an indecent photo of a child, 2 counts of making an indecent photo of a child, and 1 count of distributing an indecent photo of a child. All the charges, involving still images and videos, related to Preston Davey and are alleged to have occurred between March and July of 2023. He also denies 7 counts of possession of extreme pornography between 2017 and July 2023. Varley is also jointly charged with McGowan Fazakerley with 1 count of the sexual assault of Preston Davey, which he denies. His co-accused pleaded not guilty to the same offense and also denies 2 counts of cruelty and 1 count of allowing the death of a child. Judge Altham remanded both men, who lived in Grimsarg near Preston, into custody ahead of a pretrial hearing in January. A police investigation first began after officers were called to Blackpool Victoria Hospital at 9:15 on July 27, 2023, after the baby was brought in unresponsive. Preston was pronounced dead a short time later. Islam is right about gays. So is Christianity. All religions are. And so is nature. When buggers defy nature, nature exacts a brutal revenge. That was the lesson. That is the story of HIV, of AIDS. As Pat Buchanan famously put it, homosexuals, they have declared war upon nature, and now nature is extracting an awful retribution. Increasingly, medical interventions are able to hide some of the most deadly physical consequences. That is, again, the story of AIDS and HIV, but not the spiritual or the psychological ones. As for jumping to the conclusion that buggers are pederasts, that is, homosexuals tend to be vastly overrepresented among pedophiles. That is the case. It has historically been so, and though the figures are difficult to find and intentionally becoming ever more difficult to find, the data that does exist bears this out. I'm going to read now from something put out by the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, which was, quote, founded to educate and assist families and communities to address and prevent the exploitation of children, unquote. This is what the JWRC marshals as evidence to allegedly debunk the association between homosexuality and pedophilia. From the JWRC, science and case management experience has shown us that most child molesters are heterosexual. Abuse is about power and control and is not anchored by sexual orientation. Dr. Gene Abel, a researcher in the field of sexual violence for over 25 years, wrote an article for The Average Parent in Red Book magazine to take the knowledge he gained in doing over 100 scientific articles to provide specific warning signs for parents and caregivers. In this article, he explicitly states that most cases of boys being molested are attributed to heterosexuals. Quote within a quote, most men who molest little boys are not gay. Only 21% of the child molesters we studied who assault little boys were exclusively homosexual. Nearly 80% of the men who molested little boys were heterosexual or bisexual, and most of these men were married and had children of their own, unquote. And unquote again. It's hardly breaking news to point out that when men call themselves bisexual, they are overwhelmingly homosexual, but just haven't fully admitted it to themselves or the rest of the world yet. And so that is quite the prestidigitation there to point out that only 21% of the child molesters we studied who assaulted little boys were exclusively homosexual. And then the residual, almost 80% of the men, were either heterosexual or bisexual. Why not break the data down by those 3 sexual orientations, or group the non-normative 2 sexual orientations, homosexuality and bisexuality, together and then contrast that to heterosexuality? That is, of course, a rhetorical question. That the reason it was presented this way, the point was obfuscation. That was not a bug. That is a feature of presenting it this way. Surveys show men who are asked about their sexual orientation who give something other than heterosexual tend to break about 60% homosexual and 40% bisexual. So if we use those figures, we sub those figures in, and we assume that the bisexual and the homosexual victimization rates are about the same, then we could come up with some rough figure of around 30% of these molestations being attributed to homosexuals, whether they call themselves homosexual or bisexual. And these figures were gathered in the 80s and 90s when self-identified homosexuals or bisexuals constituted less than 3% of the adult male population. And so if we accept the veracity of these figures, while it is technically true that the absolute majority of abuse is committed by heterosexuals, the rate of abuse is 10 times higher, over 10 times higher, among homosexuals than it is among heterosexuals. And so these figures don't at all argue for the point that the JWRC thinks that they do. That sort of innumeracy is pretty common in the social working professions. Allow me a personal digression here. When I was in college, one of my earliest red-pilling experiences, one of the earliest ones I recall, was in a sociology class with a sociology professor who, in the course of teaching a lesson, I forget what the official subject was supposed to be, but the subtext of which was very clearly the idea that men are irredeemable sexual predators. She claimed that one obvious piece of evidence for how men were much more sexually driven than women was that a meta-analysis of surveys inquiring about the average number of sexual partners a person has during their lifetimes, that men averaged 6 and women averaged 2. And so I skeptically interjected for clarification, this average we're talking about is a mean, right? Not a median, not a mode. And she responded that it was the average. And then after a little bit of back and forth, we concluded that average in this case was what is most commonly used in the vernacular to refer to an average, and that is the mean. And so I responded, well, of course, these figures are incorrect. Either men are lying or women are lying or both are lying. But unless there are 3 times as many women in the world as there are men in the world, these figures could not possibly be veracious on both ends. I won't go into exactly why now to avoid being insulting to people who intuitively grasp this. And if you don't, no need to feel bad. People have differing mathematical and statistical inclinations. That's fine. That's why professions like sociology exist, for people who have skill sets in other areas. And there's nothing at all wrong with that, as long as you stay in your lane. And especially if you're a professor, you don't profess things that are obviously incorrect without even realizing that you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't currently know, then create your own little mini society, write it out on a piece of paper. A population of 20 people, 10 men, 10 women, A through J, and label the women 1 through 10, and assign a number of opposite sex partners to each of the 10 men. And in so doing, you will have completed the other half. You will have also paired the 10 women with some number of conjugal interactions with the 10 men. And what you will see is that no matter how you slice it, no matter how you pair it off, your mean number of women that the men have had sex with will be exactly the same as the mean number of men that the women have had sex with. And when I raised this objection, the professor scoffed at it. And because it was in the middle of class, and because I heard groaning from other people, and because I was thinking of it on the spot without being able to give it a private moment of ponderance, I just let it go. Maybe I was missing something obvious. And so I'd verify my initial reaction later that day and then follow up from there, which I did via email. Never heard back. Never returned to the class. Probably wasn't going to learn anything there anyway. And given 21st century grade inflation, had no problem acing the class anyway. Returning to the JWRC putative refutation of the association between homosexuality and pederasty, we get this, quote, "Thankfully, most Americans have heard that message loud and clear. In a 1999 random digit dialing phone survey, the belief that most gay men are likely to molest or abuse children was endorsed by only 19% of heterosexual men and 10% of heterosexual women," unquote. Yeah, I'm as unapologetically empirical and hard-nosed and clinical and unsympathetic of homosexual actions as anyone is, but of course I would never assert that most gay men molest and abuse children. No, obviously not. But if they're an order of magnitude more likely to molest kids than straight guys are, that has real social ramifications. Most gang members don't commit murder, but gang members are far more likely to commit murder than non-gang members are. It would seem pretty silly to say that because most gang members have never committed homicide, the propensity of gangs to murder people isn't a problem at all. And when it comes to the sexual abuse of little boys, the problem is even more pronounced than that 10x rate that homosexuals abuse children at compared to heterosexuals, because gay men tend to have much less access to young children than straight men do. The fertility rate of heterosexual men is 500% that of homosexual men in the United States. Most heterosexual men have children, and those children put them in the proximity of other families and of other children. People are generally more likely to let their guard down around heterosexual men, particularly married heterosexual men who have children of their own, because it's natural to let your little Hayden go over and play with his friend Liam over at the Smith's house than it would ever be to have Hayden go be under the supervision of a gay man or a gay couple without children of their own. And so if Liam Smith's dad is a sexual predator, Hayden is in some real danger. But even if your gay neighbor is as willing and aspirational a sexual predator as Liam's dad, Mr. Smith, is, Hayden's never going to be inside that gay neighbor's house without any other adults present. And so when we compound the fact that gay men are 10 times as likely to molest little boys as straight men are, with the fact that gay men have much less access to little boys to molest in the first place, well, we can extrapolate the true desire for molestation, if the circumstances permit it, to be not just 1,000% higher among gays, but 2,000, 4,000% higher. We can't nail down a hard and fast figure, but we can be confident that it is among gay men than it is among heterosexual men. So this is the crux of the matter. This is the reason that opening up adoption of infants and toddlers to gay male couples is a terrible thing to do. And unfortunately, as gay adoption becomes normalized in the West, it runs in tandem with the seemingly inexorable drive away from providing publicly accessible primary data about social problems, specifically those social problems and pathologies that are broken down by demographic characteristics like sexual orientation and race. Even our beloved General Social Survey doesn't ask about race like it used to. And this problem is perhaps most famous with regards to FBI crime data. A couple of decades ago, when American Renaissance released its now famous or infamous The Color of Crime report based on 2005 FBI data, that data set was virtually complete for the entire country. But the trend has been in recent years that major urban areas, their police departments refuse to either record the data of perpetration and victimization, especially perpetration by race. And even if they do, they don't turn that data over to the FBI, such that the latest FBI report on crime in the U.S. from 2024 is missing 10% of the population. That's tens of millions of people who are excluded because the institutions don't want to provide information that undercuts the globo homo neoliberal narrative. And rest assured, that trend will continue. Reuters Ipsos used to run a perpetual interactive poll with a whole host of demographic characteristics, and it allowed users publicly to access and cross-tab the data over time and across a whole host of questions for free with a population sample size in the hundreds of thousands. And then dissidents used that publicly available data in inconvenient ways during the first Trump presidential campaign, during the meme wars, and that tremendously insightful resource was scuttled, and it no longer exists, or it at least is no longer publicly available. And that is exactly the way the powers that be want it to be. The primary sources are going away so that only the institutionally approved secondary narrative sources are allowed to hold sway. It'll be the disinformation experts say X, and no, bigot, you cannot see the primary data that these disinformation experts are allegedly citing for the assertions that they're making, because allowing you to do so would be dangerous. For the vast majority of human history, homosexual acts have been criminal, particularly gay acts, not just in the secular law, not just in the natural law. See Pat Buchanan's aforementioned quote on the AIDS epidemic, but also in religious law. Famously, God rains down hellfire on Sodom and Gomorrah, obliterating these ancient cities and everyone living within their walls on account of the men in these cities expressing insatiable desires to have sexual relations with other men. And the focus on male homosexuality isn't an accident. The Bible doesn't even mention lesbianism. It talks about women doing unnatural things in a single verse. But that proscription of unnatural things probably refers more than anything else to anal penetration. And that is the essence of what homosexuality is. That seems like a perfectly serviceable definition of what homosexual acts entail. Anal penetration by the penis. And of course, the health risks and dangers to women from that sort of activity is presumably what the Bible is warning about. Lesbian sex is fake. Foreplay isn't sexual intercourse. But anal sex, which is how gay male sex is overwhelmingly expressed, is very real and very dangerous, as the poor 13-month-old death by anal gay rape tragically illustrates. And as a bit of an addendum, the idea that society is homophobic is exactly backwards. To put it in Kaczynski terminology, overly socialized society is homophilic. Homophobia is natural, it's visceral, and it's non-ideological. Boys make fun of other boys, at least before boyhood was outlawed, by calling them fags and homos. This existed as recently as a generation ago. When I was growing up, Smear the Queer was a pickup game that boys loved to play. And the rules, such as they were pretty simple. There was a football and a open area that someone would pick up and run with as long as they could until everybody else tackled them. And then when they got smeared, they'd cough up the ball and somebody else would pick it up, and the game would continue until, in a fit of exhaustion, everyone collapsed, or somebody got hurt, or some girl showed up and everyone started playing spin the bottle. And child molesters, especially pederasts, notoriously get it in prison. The fitting end that Jeffrey Dahmer met at the hands of other inmates is the most salient example, but the examples are many. Even among the most putatively immoral, kid diddling is a bridge too far. Hardened gangbangers will take the life of a rival gang member without batting an eye. But even among hardened criminals, that you don't bugger little kids. At least that's my conception of it. But there is an enlightened hedonist response that has some empirical grounding. That's the idea that by throwing off hidebound, superstitious religiosity, society is liberated into accepting homosexuality as another expression of human love and lust. Since its inception in the early 70s, the General Social Survey has asked respondents if, quote, homosexual sex relations, unquote, are always wrong. Then there are other varied responses like almost always wrong, wrong only sometimes, not wrong at all. But for our purposes here, we'll look at the percentages who see homosexual acts as always wrong. Among regular churchgoers, those who attend services at least on a weekly basis, over 50 years ago, in 1973, 84% of regular churchgoers said that homosexuality was always wrong. And that has slowly the moral opposition to homosexuality has eroded gently over time, but still today, as of the latest iteration of the survey in 2024, 67% of regular churchgoers said that it was always wrong. That's a drop of 17 points. Not nothing, but not alone enough to explain the almost total 180 that popular society has gone in with regards to homosexuality. That total about-face instead is explained by the massive shift in sentiments among non-churchgoers, among the irreligious. In 1973, 59%, a solid majority of the irreligious, viewed homosexual acts as always wrong. Today, just 18% feel that way. That's a shift of over 40 points. And the percentage of the population that this characterizes, non-churchgoers, has expanded rapidly. And so, to borrow a framework articulated by Aaron Renn to describe the United States as having, up until the early 90s, existed in a Christian positive environment where Christianity was viewed favorably as an honorable and legitimate source of public morality, before in the early 90s shifting towards a neutral Christian landscape until the early part of the 2010s, when American society shifted decidedly and, likely in my view, though not necessarily his, irreversibly into a Christian negative environment, with the punctuation point of that shift having been completed being the total triumph of the same-sex marriage movement. So hey, they got us on homosexuality. They caused the scales to fall from our eyes, enlighten us all, and now it's not just something we tolerate or even celebrate. It's increasingly something that more and more people participate in, as Gallup polling shows that among Gen Z and younger, approaching 20% of respondents, 1 in 5, identify as something other than heterosexual. And so maybe in a few more years, they'll convince us that pederasty, the pedophilia, is just another thing we have hidebound hang-ups about. After all, love is love. Who are you to get in the way of it? So, okay, what do we do with homosexuals? People are attracted to what they're attracted to. You can't control that. Putting aside the fact that it's a little more nuanced than that, particularly in the case of female homosexuality, that is lesbianism, which does seem to be more attuned to social pressures and the social contagion effect. But granting that homosexuality is innate, probably not genetic in nature, because, as mentioned previously, there is vanishingly little short of dying or being totally infertile that is worse for reproductive fitness than homosexuality is. And so if there was a genetic component to it, then by just about any understanding of sexual selection, it would have been bred out of humanity, out of mammals, out of the animal kingdom millennia ago. But it could be the consequence of some in utero exposure, perhaps an infection, as Gregory Cochran hypothesizes, a gay germ. Okay, let's grant that's the case. What do we do about that? Shouldn't we just let them express themselves sexually? Well, probably not. Not if we also grant that it is deleterious, that it has negative consequences, not just physical, a la AIDS and ruptured anal tissue, but also spiritually and psychologically. Well, if we grant that, then yes, it should be prevented. imagine running this same analysis with what we're talking about here, apropos the previous discussion. Imagine running the same analysis on pedophilia, on a sexual desire for infants and toddlers. Well, more easily, I think we all grant that that is harmful. And as a consequence of that harm, the social consensus is, or mostly is, that no, you can't do it. Even if you were born that way, you can't do it. The population of 40-year-old virgins, heterosexual 40-year-old virgins, is larger than the population of homosexual men, at least pre-Gen Z and below. And even though there is no de jure prohibition on these 40-year-old virgins having the heterosexual relations that they desire, there is a de facto social restriction on them being able to do so. And so should we feel as equally sorry for those people as we do for homosexuals who can't act on their sexual desires? At least in the case of the 40-year-old virgins, there is some procreative social benefit in rearranging things so that they can act on their desires in the same way that homosexuals want to act on theirs.
Inspired by the most logical race in the galaxy, the Vulcans, breeding will be permitted once every 7 years. For many of you, this will mean much less breeding. For me, much, much more.
You cannot do that, sir!
Non-ironically, though, Helen Lovejoy asks the most pertinent question, and if our primary concern is to think of the children, then the sad story that we opened the recording with is an argument in favor of, if not outright condemning homosexual acts, then at the very least putting them back in the closet. Moving on, a couple of weeks ago, the Supreme Court heard arguments on birthright citizenship, the clause in the 14th Amendment that grants citizenship to those born in the United States who are, quote, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, is a tough one for those who want to see a birthright citizenship eradicated, because lawbreakers of any type inside the sovereign borders of a country are subject to that sovereign. And so if illegal aliens existing inside of the borders of the United States are subject to the authorities of said United States on account of being inside the borders illegally, or in the case of legal migrants or people on visas still being subject to the laws of the land while they're inside its borders, well, it's hard to get around that clause. But even if the long-standing, since 1898 precedent that birthright citizenship is the law of the land, even if that is overturned, pragmatically, I suspect it won't do much. Unlike Roe versus Wade being overturned, leading directly to far fewer abortions occurring in red states, particularly deeply red, socially conservative red states in the South and Midwest. Unlike that ruling, this ruling wouldn't stop the demographic transformation. It will likely galvanize open borders supporters while doing nothing to stem the tide of migration into the United States, let alone reverse it. That requires executive action, and a favorable judicial ruling without that executive action is entirely impotent. What do the countries of Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, and the Netherlands all have in common? Well, yes, they all have huge migrant problems, and they also, none of them have birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship, or the lack thereof, isn't the problem. The problem is political will. And like in the case of Roe versus Wade being overturned in terms of the political ramifications, this, if anything, overturning birthright citizenship will bolster the political will of the open borders forces. And even while the case's outcome hangs in the Supreme Court judicial balance, restrictionist sentiment in the broader public largely just isn't there. From an Economist YouGov survey released this week, first asking about legal immigration, asking if, quote, the number of legal immigrants allowed into the U.S. each year should be increased or decreased, unquote. The percentages who say it should either be decreased or zeroed out entirely, that there should be a moratorium on legal immigration. Among men, 32% want a reduction in legal immigration. Among women, 30%. So there's not much of a gender difference here. By race, 35% of whites want legal immigration reduced, 17% of blacks, and 28% of Hispanics do. As to the question of why blacks want to increase legal immigration, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that it could be as simple as legal immigration is perceived as being anti-white. This is example 4,753 of blacks being more pro-immigration and less immigration restrictionist than Hispanics. The real black pill on the immigration question is the generational one, though. By generational cohort, among Zoomers, just 13% want legal immigration reduced. Among millennials, it's 29%. Among Gen Xers, 43%. And among boomers, 35%. The Groypers are nowhere close to a majority among the Zoomers. Among those without a college degree, 35% want it reduced. Among those with a college degree, just 27% want it decreased. Democrats, only 10%, so 1 in 10 Democrats want a reduction in legal immigration. Among independents, it's 27%. Even among Republicans, it's just 57%. Ted Cruz came in for a lot of mockery, tweeting his analysis of immigration being thus: legal immigration good, illegal immigration bad. But if his is a minority position among Republicans while being a massive majority position among the broader public, even if it is a minority position among Republicans, it's only marginally so, with barely a majority of Republicans expressing a desire for legal immigration to be reduced. With ICE reporting the lowest number of weekly deportations in the last 6 months, this most recently completed month, the survey also asked what respondents would like to see done with illegal aliens, or immigrants as the survey calls them, in the United States. Among men, 41% want them to be deported, 36% of women want them to be deported. Among whites, 44% want deportation, 20% of blacks want deportation, and 32% of Hispanics want deportation. So there's example 4,674 or whatever. There's the next example of blacks being more pro-immigration than Hispanics are in the U.S. Among Zoomers, just 21%. So only 1 in 5 Zoomers want illegal aliens living in the United States to be deported. Among millennials, it's 27%, so just 1 in 4. Among Xers, 51%, and among boomers, 48%. So half of Xers, half of boomers, a quarter of millennials, and only a fifth of Zoomers want illegal aliens deported from the U.S. Those without a college degree, 41% want deportation, compared to just 33% of those with a college degree. Democrats, only 9% want deportation, 32% of independents do, and 73% of Republicans do. Old white Republican men are the only ones who have anything close to the stomach for mass deportations. And they are, of course, public enemy number one, and they're in the process of exiting stage left, and good riddance anyway. The other two responses besides deportation, other than not sure, that respondents could give was that they should be allowed to stay in the U.S. and eventually apply for citizenship, or that they should be allowed to stay in the U.S. but not become citizens. That allow them to stay in the U.S. but as effectively second-class citizens who don't have citizenship. That only 6% of the total population supported that option, and yet Republicans, being as politically inept as they could possibly be, in the same vein that has led to them failing to be able to pass the SAVE Act that has 80% popular approval, this approach that a whopping 6% of the public supports is the one that Maria Salazar, congressperson from Florida, is out crisscrossing the country campaigning for, what she calls the Dignity Act, which effectively allows everyone to come here but doesn't grant them citizenship, at least not this iteration of the bill, though she has in interviews talked about how in the future she suspects that is something that will be incorporated. And so this brilliant Republican plan is to continue shepherding in the demographic transformation of the country, but just retard its political ramifications, its political implications for a few more years by not allowing the demographic tip of the spear to participate in the electoral process, at least at the federal level, just yet. We can't make it a week without talking about Tucker Carlson, so this week on the Carlson Corner, we'll mention that Carlson brought up John Chrysostom favorably. Chrysostom was Archbishop of Constantinople, now known as Istanbul in modern-day Turkey, in the late 4th and early 5th century. He is one of the most well-regarded church fathers among the faithful, with a revered theological and intellectual pedigree that has been taught and studied for 1,600 years. If Westerners in the post-Christian modern West have heard of him, though, it is likely on account of his ascribed anti-Semitism for 8 homilies he gave severely attacking Jews. And so it is in this context that Tucker Carlson, bringing him up favorably, not for his homilies against the Jews, at least not ostensibly for that reason. That is a very small fraction of John Chrysostom's total output. The homilies were all given in the course of a year by a man who had a very public career spanning several decades. And it was in the context of the wide body of his other theological and philosophical writings, and more aptly preachings, that Carlson brought him up. But that's not what Carlson's enemies are going to focus on. And though Christian thought for the religion's first 1,800 years is essentially uniformly anti-Semitic, Chrysostom is the Catholic, like Luther is the Protestant, that the Nuremberg regime, that is the ruling power structure that has been in place since the conclusion of the Second World War, they bring up Christianity's dark history by pointing more than anyone else at these two individuals, with anti-Semitism as this underlying narrative that runs all the way through back to the beginning of Christianity through to the present today. And Jews are not unjustified in feeling some hostility from John Chrysostom. Just to take one excerpt here that will serve a dual purpose in allowing me to talk about another aspect of modern Christianity, but that serves as a perfectly serviceable excerpt to get at Chrysostom's sentiments with regards to the Jews. Quote, "Do not be surprised that I called the Jews pitiable. They really are pitiable and miserable. When so many blessings from heaven came into their hands, they thrust them aside and were at great pains to reject them. The morning sun of justice arose for them, but they thrust aside its rays and still sit in darkness. We, who were nurtured by darkness, drew the light to ourselves and were freed from the gloom of their error. They were the branches of that holy root, but those branches were broken. We had no share in the root, but we did reap the fruit of godliness. From their childhood they read the prophets, but they crucified him whom the prophets had foretold. We did not hear the divine prophecies, but we did worship him of whom they prophesied. And so they are pitiful because they rejected the blessings which were sent to them, while others seized hold of those blessings and drew them to themselves." Tucker Carlson brought St. John Chrysostom up in the context of what Carlson called Israelism, which rhetorically seems like a pretty effective term. It naturally contrasts with America First without running into the baggage associated with terms like Zionist occupied government or the Jews control everything. And so sending America Firsters, sending Heritage Americans down that path is a good one. Most Americans, as mentioned before, haven't heard of Chrysostom because America is barely a culturally Christian society anymore, let alone one that's steeped in the history of Christian thought. But Chrysostom, despite being one of the oldest church fathers, he was writing more than 800 years before Thomas Aquinas, and over 1100 years before Martin Luther and the other reformers like John Calvin and Zwingli and Melanchthon. Despite being so archaic, he is a good read. Most of what comes down to posterity from Chrysostom were the sermons that he delivered orally. And so they are accessible and express ideas clearly and lucidly, but still simply, and in a way that is easy to follow and grasp. And so the unavoidable conclusion that many people who follow this path are going to come to is, well, man, he was right about all these things. So is he just wrong about the Jews? Or maybe the Jews are wrong about him. In any case, I think it's at least something I should investigate instead of just assuming what the people who have an axe to grind against him have to say about him. Parenthetically, let me slip in something that will be a recurring, noted theme instead of one that's just existing in the subtext, and that is go for the primary sources. Read the primary material. Do not read the secondary stuff. Do not read what journalists say about things, how they characterize events that happened. Don't listen to the secondhand sources. They never or very rarely have veracity or understanding the material being discussed as the primary priority. If it's even a priority at all, at most it tends to be just incidental in serving some political or cultural agenda. Where possible, go for the primary sources. And I realize with the onset of AI, I'm like King Canute, trying to change the tides. So anyway, this is the discussion that heritage Americans need to have, because if they don't have that, if they just accept that Chrysostom was a horrible anti-Semite and Martin Luther is a horrible anti-Semite and really all of Christianity is pretty much horribly anti-Semitic. And when you really think about it, America First and MAGA is pretty anti-Semitic. And in fact, anything that isn't what Tucker Carlson refers to as Israelism is sort of anti-Semitic. If they don't ask those hard questions, then we're ceding that all revered historical figures from the ancestral past will go from being heroes to being flawed figures of history to basically being Hitler. What do I mean by this? Meditate on how Robert E. Lee was more popularly regarded 50 years ago in the United States than George Washington is regarded today. The 2020 cultural ruction, attempted cultural revolution, was when General E. Lee went definitively from being a flawed figure of history to basically being Hitler. Today, Washington is still hanging on to that flawed figures category, but the progressive vanguard has him in the basically Hitler bin. He was a colonialist, he was a racist, he was a misogynist, he owned slaves. And right-wing progressives like Eric Erickson will eventually follow that progressive lead and dump him just like they dumped Robert E. Lee. Meditate, too, on the incoming hate Carlson's receiving for positively mentioning John Chrysostom, with the reigning IHRA definition of anti-Semitism being codified into statutes in several American states and also several countries throughout the world. The latest tally shows 38 U.S. states and 47 countries adopting or endorsing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Some examples from the IHRA guidelines: accusing Jews or Israel of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Anyone who has studied history knows notoriously that estimates of casualty figures are inaccurate, often embellished, or the sources disagree, or the cause of death, the intention of death is unclear. But don't you dare suggest that only 5,999,999 Jews perished in the Holocaust, because if you do, you're anti-Semitic. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel than to the interests of their own nations, like what Ben Shapiro has literally said, and what a sitting senator of Texas has effectively said. And this one's the real whopper: using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, such as claims of Jews killing Jesus. So the Gospels are anti-Semitic by this definition, very clearly and unambiguously. Reading the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, picking up at verse 20. The chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas, but to destroy Jesus. The governor, that is Pontius Pilate, said to them in reply, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" They answered, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus called Messiah?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." But he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" They only shouted the louder, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he was not succeeding at all, but that a riot was breaking out instead, he took water and washed his hands in the sight of the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. Look to it yourselves." And the whole people said in reply, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." And the people there, to be clear, this is in Jerusalem, were Jews. This is why Pilate was referring to Jesus as King of the Jews. And so there is this relentless culture of critique leveled against every traditional, conventional, Occidental Christian tradition and philosophy and institution, down to the most fundamental. You actually think you're a man? Are you sure? You think that punctuality is something that should be celebrated? That's just your white privilege speaking. You think America's the land of the free? It was built by African slaves and stolen from peace-loving natives. But don't you dare question the modern state of Israel's foreign policy initiatives, you anti-Semite, or we will destroy you. It is a relentless culture of critique for me, not even the most established critique, literally the Bible for thee. I want to close by stressing just how ahistorical Christian Zionism is. It's as recent on the scene as Mormonism. The Old Testament is largely one long story of God criticizing Israel for behaving horribly despite having God's blessing, with admonitions that if Israel doesn't shape up, they're going to be shipped out. That's what happened to 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. They were the chosen people. Okay, so was Lucifer. We don't get nearly as much detail about the process that led to God casting Lucifer and his rebellious murder of angels out of heaven, but presumably the fallen angels had their share of chances too. There's as much scriptural justification for arguing Jews are the human parallel to Lucifer and his fallen angels, while Gentiles are the human parallel to God's angels, as there is for Christian Zionism. Lucifer was the highest archangel, the most chosen angel of all, and yet he had the most spectacular, acrimonious falling out with God of any other being in creation. To be clear, I think making that argument is ridiculous. Christ's sacrifice transferred the old, broken, corrupted covenant with a fallen people to all of humanity, understanding all of humanity as being hopelessly fallen without God's grace. But that's exactly the point. Just like Christian Zionism, Jewish Luciferianism is risible. And these good Christian souls, these good heritage Americans who are being led astray by the likes of Paula White and John Hagee, should show no more reverence for Christian Zionism than they do for the Jewish Luciferianism I just spun, or the teachings of Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church. In fact, the latter is far closer to the God of Scripture than the Christian Zionists are. And note, too, that Jewish Luciferianism I spun up that paralleled the elevated stature initially given to the Israel of the Old Testament that was eventually destroyed on account of offending God, with Lucifer being elevated as the highest archangel, then being cast out of heaven as a would-be usurper, who then, having held the highest position, now is the personification of sin, the very thing God hates more than anything else. Compare that to the John Chrysostom excerpt from the first homily against the Jews that I will reread here. Do not be surprised that I called the Jews pitiable. They really are pitiable and miserable. When so many blessings from heaven came into their hands, they thrust them aside and were at great pains to reject them. The morning sun of justice arose for them, but they thrust aside its rays and still sit in darkness. We, who were nurtured by darkness, drew the light to ourselves and were freed from the gloom of their error. They were the branches of that holy root, but those branches were broken. We had no share in the root, but we did reap the fruit of godliness. From their childhood they read the prophets, but they crucified him who the prophets had foretold. We did not hear the divine prophecies, but we did worship him of whom they prophesied. And so they are pitiful because they rejected the blessings which were sent to them, while others seized hold of those blessings and drew them to themselves. And so realize that, too, is arguably closer to what we find in Scripture than anything that comes out of the mouths of the modern Christian Zionists. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.